welcome to the Bible study. My name is Kent Philpott, pastor of Miller Avenue Baptist Church, Mill Valley, California. And this is Bible study. And we are in one of the most interesting chapters in the entire Bible as far as I'm concerned. Chapter 2 of Acts, verses 1 to 13. Luke is the one who wrote the book of Acts. It's the story of what happened after Jesus was crucified, buried, resurrected, and ascended into heaven. And it was one of the feasts. There were four major feasts that have gone on. Passover, Jesus was crucified on Passover. Unleavened bread, second one. Jesus was buried on the Feast of Unleavened Bread. First fruits was when Jesus was resurrected. These are all hundreds of years old feasts and festivals. And then now we're looking at Pentecost, the coming of the Holy Spirit. It's also known as the Feast of Weeks. Coming those many weeks after the last one of first fruits of Passover, really. So that's what it is. And the Pentecost, they celebrated the wheat and barley harvest. Wheat and barley harvest, and it also became associated with the giving of the law by Moses, the beginning of the law. There are three other feasts that are yet to come. Trumpets, Day of Atonement, Feast of Booths. There are seven altogether. Jesus fulfilled the first four, and Christians of all through the ages noted wouldn't be surprised if he did trumpets, Feast of Atonement, and trumpets, Feast, Day of Atonement, Feast of Booths. They fit perfectly in with the whole second coming. Okay, that's enough of that. So let's take a look. Acts chapter 2, verse 1. The English Standard Version calls this the coming of the Holy Spirit. Other translations say the descent of the Holy Spirit. Verse 1. When the day of Pentecost arrived, that's again 50 days after Passover, they were all together in one place. That's a mystery as where that one place was. It is that there were more than just the apostles at that point, 12, because they elected Matthias to fill Judas's place. But we're also talking about the 120. And it was just too big, too many people, if it would view it as being in the upper room where Jesus celebrated the Last Supper. So we don't really know where this took place. Verse 2, and suddenly, notice the word suddenly, there came from heaven a sound like a mighty rushing wind. Now, this, I don't have the time, I'd bore you to death to go through a bunch of passages which suggest that wind here is a symbol of the Holy Spirit. By the way, likely this took place at some place in the temple. And so it says, and it filled the entire house. Now, of course, I just made a mistake, didn't I? It filled the entire house. I am going to suspect that it was just the 12 there. And that in the upper room where Mary, the mother of John Mark, the author of the second gospel, lived. Apparently a big place. Okay, so I have to back up a little bit. And so it filled the entire house where they were sitting. There they were. Verse 3, and divided tongues as a fire appeared to them and rested on each one of them. Now, we know from reading further that this took place at about 9 a.m. in the morning, the third hour of the day, which started at 6 a.m. So we're looking at 9 a.m. And later on, when people say, what are these guys doing, all this noise? They say they were drunk with wine. No, and Peter says, no, impossible. It's only 9 o'clock in the morning. Interesting. Anyway, so and so it filled the entire house. I want to read John 3:8 real quick, where we find the wind again. The wind blows where it pleases, and you hear the sound of it, but you do not know from where it comes or where it goes. So it is with everyone who was born of the Spirit. It can introduce some complex understandings, and scholars down through the centuries have differed from each other, not majorly, as to how that is to be understood. But divided tongues, in Exodus chapter 3, Moses comes across a bush that is burning, but is not consumed. So there were divided tongues, something that they could see, something the first time ever in the history of the world this event takes place. We don't have the capacity to fully grasp exactly what's going on. The commentaries that I have read over the decades that I've been preaching through book of Acts, and by the way, while I've been pastor at Miller Avenue Church, this is my third time preaching through Acts, and numbers of times prior to that. But it said it appeared to them and rested on each one of them. Rested on each one of them, so they could see there was the wind and the flame, and it looked like it was coming upon each one of them. Nobody really fully understands that. So that's what happened. Then verse 4, it says, and they were all filled with the Holy Spirit and began to speak in other tongues as the Spirit gave them utterance. Wow. They were filled with the Holy Spirit. It means that they were indwelt by the Holy Spirit. First time, indwelt, filled with the Holy Spirit. A once and for all event for every individual. And what they began to do, they began to speak in tongues. Glossias is the Greek word. Glossias. And it means languages. They began to speak in other languages as the Spirit, the Holy Spirit, gave them utterance. Now, what was that? What were they speaking in known languages? This is the issue, which divides a lot of Christians. You know, there are so many things that divide Christians. Not horrible divisions, but you'll never find two Christians who agree on everything. We disagree with each other. Perfectly fine, actually healthy. The cultic mentality maintains that everybody's got to believe exactly the same. Well, that's never been true among ordinary Christians. And being a pastor for 55 years, I can give proof to that in our church. My wife and I differ on points of theology. My son, Vernon, who you just saw last week, we have differing points of view. Understand, we all going to do that. We'll have differing points of view. The cultic mentality is you've got to be all exactly in line. But some will say they spoke in known languages, or they spoke in words that they couldn't understand. I like to say, shandala bundala, shandala bundala. Well, that's, they heard the tongues, but my opinion is they were speaking in real tongues, and I think we'll get to hear this. So was it a meeting of speaking or hearing? And my position is the miracle of speaking, not hearing. So this is not the first or the last time this is ever going to happen. In Acts chapter 19, verse 6, 17 chapters from now, it says, "And when Paul laid his hands on them, the Holy Spirit came on them, and they began speaking in tongues and prophesying." They began to talk in other languages. And that's very interesting. Okay, verse 5 says, "Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem Jews, devout men from every nation under heaven." Now, I probably waste everybody's time by pointing out some, not so important things, but it says dwelling in Jerusalem Jews. Various manuscripts don't have the word Jews there. For example, my favorite Greek version of the Bible, Sinaiticus, does not have, it just doesn't have Jews. It says, "Now there were dwelling in Jerusalem." Then it goes on to say, "devout men from every nation under heaven." It's not every nation under heaven, but it was what they thought was every nation under heaven. But there was a lot of them. We're going to get down to those a little bit later. Verse 6, "At this sound the multitude came together." Now, apparently, they were in a place and circumstance where this happened that other people heard, and all of a sudden, a big crowd joined. We're going to see. It's a huge crowd. And again, Luke is not very detailed oriented all the time. And this is one of those times. We don't know exactly where this took place. Many think it took place someplace within the temple. So devout men, and remember, there would be women as well. That's just the way that they wrote in those days. And devout men from every nation under heaven. And at this sound, they heard them speaking these languages. The multitude came together. And this must have taken place someplace in the temple. And it says, "And they were bewildered," because each one was hearing them speak in his own language. They were hearing that. Now, again, somebody will say, well, it was like I like to say, but the miracle was in when they spoke this funny language, but it was in the miracle of hearing. My view is they spoke really different languages. That the people that had come to Pentecost, and it was one of the great festivals. Everybody was supposed to come, and the place would be filled with huge numbers of people. And so I believe they were actually hearing real languages, and in his own dialect. The word language here is dialect. Verse 7, "And they were amazed and astonished, saying, 'Are not all these who were speaking Galileans?'" Now, here's a very interesting thing. All that were speaking were Galileans. You're going to find all kinds of differences of opinion here. We know that the disciples, the Jesus called apostles, were from Galilee, except Judas Iscariot. He was from Judea, but he's no longer there. Okay, they were speaking Galileans. They could tell by the way they dressed and by the accent that they could hear. Verse 8. And it says, "And how is it that we hear?" Luke is reporting what had been known to the Christian community, and they knew that this happened. And they're saying, how is it that we hear, each of us, in our own native language? Okay. Again, Christians will disagree as to what was going on here. It was a miracle just in the speaking. Was it in the hearing? And again, I think they spoke real languages. And then starts to list them. Verse 9. And Luke gives us some of these people. Parthians. I'm not going to try to I should have get a map out here so I can point out, but I didn't. Parthians and Medes and Elamites and residents of Mesopotamia, Judea, in other words, more than just the area of Jerusalem. It was a fairly big area. Judea and Cappadocia, Pontus, and Asia. That would have been to the east. Phrygia and Pamphylia, Egypt, and parts of Libya belonging to Cyrene, and visitors from Rome. Now, by the way, Philo, writing in AD 38, writes that there were 1 million Jews living in Egypt at that time. About 1 million Jews living in Egypt. So, and they were even coming from Rome. Jews or Gentiles. When Gentiles were believing in the Hebrew Bible, Genesis all the way through, and they identified with Judaism, a lot of the women would become proselytes, but the men would become what they called God-fearers. So you had natural-born Jews, Gentiles who followed, called God-fearers, and then proselytes. That's what happened. So they hear them telling in their own languages the mighty works of God. The mighty works of Jesus. How that they were telling this. It's amazing. Verse 12. And all were amazed. All were amazed and perplexed, saying to one another, what does this mean? What does this mean? They really didn't know what was going on here. What an event. This is where the church really begins, what we would call the church. And the word church comes from the Greek word is ekklesia. Ek means out, and klesia means called out. You're called out of the world. You don't belong to the world anymore. You belong to Jesus. You're part of the family of God, and so ekklesia. And once in a while, I will tell the story about how we got a hold of the word church along in the process, and only for many, many hundreds of years following the very beginning of it. Ekklesia, called out ones, called out from the world, called to Jesus. So, and it says, but others mocking said, they are filled with new wine. They're filled with new wine, glucose. So there they were. The word actually, new wine, means sweet wine or newly picked and fermented wine. But it was actually wine. Actually, Peter, in the next couple of verses that we're not going to be looking at now, says, Peter starts out defending, he says, these men are not drunk. And basically says it's only 9 o'clock in the morning. So here we find how the gospel message quickly began to spread all over. And it spread quickly. We're going to find out that a large number of people are going to be converted here. Actually, the number is around 3,000. And there are some estimates that within a relatively short period of time, approximately 20,000 people became converted, and this in the opening months of Christianity. So that's what we've got there. So some of my closing thoughts are there are 7, and 7 of these feasts. We're looking at the one here today, Pentecost. And so now all of a sudden, the first 4 are now complete. The remaining 3 are, 1, the Feast of Trumpets. We don't have time to go into that discussion, maybe one day. Then the Day of Atonement, and then the Feast of Booths. And by the way, they perfectly line up with what takes place at the time of the second coming of Jesus. By the way, the Feast of Israel, the 7 of them, I have written a short little pamphlet about the Feast of Israel. And I'd be glad to send it to anybody. No cost involved. If you email me, I'll send this. I'll send the whole thing to you. It's very short. The Feast of Israel, all 7 of them. So just email me, kentphilpott@comcast.net. Comcast.net. I'll be glad to send it to you. Again, no money involved. Very simply written and relatively short. So as we go on in the book of Acts, in Acts chapter 10 and Acts chapter 19, we find that there are still going on speaking in tongues. Speaking in tongues. And let me tell you that a little story. I spoke in tongues myself from 1968 to 1975. I never tried to. In fact, I was against it. I thought, oh, that's what these crazy Pentecostals, that's what I learned at the First Baptist Church in Fairfield. That they took a very narrow view of Pentecostalism and speaking in tongues in particular. I learned that at that church and also when I went to seminary. And so here I am then. Here I am in the Haight-Ashbury. Started in February 1967. And I'm doing on-the-street ministry right there. And I was against speaking in tongues. Long story short, I ended up, while I was still ministering, I sent my family down to Sunland, my family home in Sunland, California, northern part of Los Angeles. And every other week, for 2 weeks, I would come up and I would be doing my street preaching ministry in the Haight-Ashbury. And I was living at the Lincoln Park Baptist Church on Balboa between 41st and 42nd. It's an Egyptian restaurant now. But, and so I'm there, and I'd had other people pressing me, trying to get me to speaking tongues. There was the Clayton House run by Teen Challenge, David Wilkerson's Teen Challenge. And one time they got me up there, got me on a table, and were moving my mouth, trying to get me to speak in tongues. And that just reinforced me not ever to do that. And so it doubled my against speaking in tongues. But then here I am, and one night, early in the morning, my sleeping bag rolled up underneath the podium at the little church there, storefront church, and I woke up in the morning speaking in tongues. Yep, I didn't try to do it. I was speaking in tongues. I didn't understand anything that I was saying, but I knew was speaking in tongues. Well, as time went on, it proved itself over and over again to be a prayer language. It was actually prayer. I know that some of you who are anti-charismatic Pentecostals are listening to this right now, and you're saying, Come on, Philpott. You're going to tell us this crazy story again? Yes, I am. Because it really happened. And and from that time until 1975, I spoke in tongues. I never one time tried to. I never knew what I was saying. Never knew one thing. But I know Mark Buckley and I, when we did our deliverance ministry up at the Solid Rock House on Wilson and Novato in the back garage there, we would speak in tongues, and a person would put his hands over their ears and say, "Stop that perfect prayer." I didn't know what I was saying. I didn't know what Mark was saying. And we didn't really try. We just we'd be praying, and all of a sudden we'd be speaking in tongues. And so I saw that in the Jesus People movement, and in various awakenings across our history, we find this. I would guess that maybe half of some of the great moves of the Holy Spirit did not see speaking in tongues and a lot of the miracles that we saw. But I have to tell you, even though I'm a diehard Baptist, and but the gifts of the Holy Spirit, you never know what God does. But I'll never forget hearing the words, "Stop that perfect prayer." Wow. Okay, we've come to the end of it. We're in the book of Acts, one of the great passages to look over, the history of the early church as told by a Gentile, Luke, who was a doctor. And so we look forward to that, and we're coming to some incredible passages. All right, so long.